The key didn't fit. Not my key, anyway. It was a brass key, worn smooth in all the right places from 30 years of use. A key I could have identified by touch in a pitch-black room. It was the key to my front door, to the house my wife Eleanor and I built with our own hands on the shore of Whisper Lake. I had just driven for 3 days straight from the edge of the Arctic Circle, a journey fueled by stale coffee and the deep, abiding ache to be home. And the key, my key, slid into the lock only to stop with a hard, metallic finality. A foreign object was in its way. For a moment, I just stood there on the pine needle-strewn porch, the scent of lake water and damp earth filling my lungs. It was a scent I had dreamed of in my cramped bunk in the Alaskan tundra. I looked at the lock. It was new. A shiny, cheap, brass-plated thing from a big-box store, an insult to the heavy, oil-rubbed bronze hardware Eleanor had insisted on. My gaze drifted to the windows. There were new curtains, not Eleanor's simple linen panels, but some garish floral print in shades of pink and green that screamed of suburban desperation. A light was on in the living room, a soft, yellow glow that was utterly alien. Someone was in my house. My first thought, born of 40 years spent as a geological surveyor in remote, often dangerous places, was purely practical. Assess the situation. Don't react. I stepped back off the porch, my boots making no sound on the soft earth, and moved into the shadows of the tall pines that bordered the property. The house sat there, a dark shape against the moonlit water. It was more than wood and stone to me. It was a living archive of my marriage. I could point to the hearth and remember the weekend Eleanor and I hauled every single river stone up from the shore. I could touch the hand-hewn mantelpiece and feel the phantom pain of the splinter I got carving her initials into the underside. Every nail, every board was a memory, and a stranger was inside. A car door slammed somewhere down the lane, and moments later, headlights swept across the front of my property. A pristine white Range Rover, gleaming under the moon like a polished tooth, crunched to a halt in my driveway. The driver's side door opened, and a woman emerged. She was tall, thin, and moved with an imperious stiffness that suggested a spine made of rebar. Even from 50 yards away, I could see her face was a mask of taut, unmoving perfection, the kind that costs a small fortune to maintain. She was talking on her phone, her voice a sharp, commanding staccato that cut through the quiet night. She unlocked my front door with her own key and disappeared inside. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew her type. I'd seen them in corporate boardrooms and at contentious town hall meetings. They operated on the unshakable belief that the world was their personal property, and the rest of us were just trespassing. I retreated back to my truck, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble. I didn't drive away in a rage. I didn't pound on the door. I just put the truck in reverse, my movements calm and deliberate, and found a secluded spot down the road overlooking the lake. I pulled out my field notebook and a pen. It was a habit from a lifetime of observation. Date, time, vehicle description, occupant description. The methodical act of documentation was a balm to the cold fury that was beginning to coalesce in my chest. It was a quiet, patient rage, the kind that builds pressure deep underground before it changes the entire landscape. This woman had just made a geological scale mistake. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 62 years old, and for most of my life, I mapped the Earth's hidden structures. I could read a landscape like a book, understanding the history written in layers of rock and soil. I understood stress, strain, and fracture points. My wife, Eleanor, was an architect. While I mapped the world, she designed our small corner of it. She drew the plans for the lake house on our kitchen table, and we spent 10 years of weekends bringing it to life. When cancer took her 3 years ago, the silence in that house became a physical weight. So I took a job, a long one, an 18-month contract surveying a pipeline route in the Alaskan wilderness. It was a way to outrun the quiet, to replace the ache of her absence with the ache of hard, physical work. I left the house in the care of the Lakeside Haven Estates Homeowners Association, paying my dues dutifully and assuming the veneer of civilization would be enough to protect it. Another mistake. The next morning, I found my nearest neighbor, George, a retired accountant who had lived on the lake for 50 years. He was a quiet man who noticed things. When he saw me, his face, a roadmap of pleasant wrinkles, fell. "Arthur," he said, his voice low. "I tried to call. The numbers you left weren't working." "Signal's spotty up there, George. What's going on? Who is in my house?" He sighed, looking over his shoulder as if the very air had ears. "Brenda McAllister. She's the new HOA president. Took over about a year ago." He described her reign of terror in hushed tones. Fines for unapproved bird feeders, violations for non-native flower species. A campaign to force everyone to repaint their houses in one of 3 approved shades of beige. She was a tyrant in miniature, wielding the HOA bylaws like a scepter. "She declared your house abandoned, Arthur," George said, his eyes filled with a weary sort of pity. "Said it was becoming an eyesore, a drag on property values. The board is terrified of her. She held a special meeting, pushed through some motion, and moved in." Moved in. The words felt absurd on my tongue. Joe said she was assuming custodianship to protect the community's investment. Changed the locks, had all your furniture put in storage. Said she was billing the HOA for it. She's been living there for 6 months. George's story painted a picture of a predator who had seen an opportunity and seized it with absolute confidence. She had leveraged the fear of her neighbors and the flimsy authority of an HOA to steal my home, my memories, Eleanor's legacy. The cold fury inside me began to solidify, transforming from a molten core into something hard and sharp, like obsidian. I thanked George for the information, told him to lay low, and drove to the nearest town. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. Local cops in resort towns often have a cozy relationship with the powerful. No, this was a surveying problem. I needed to map the terrain before I started drilling. I rented a sterile room in a roadside motel that smelled of industrial cleaner and regret. I set up my base of operations, my high-end laptop, a portable printer/scanner, and my trusted surveying tools. I also bought a new piece of equipment, a camera with a powerful telephoto lens. From the public boat launch across the small bay, I had a clear, unobstructed view of my house, of her in my house. The investigation began. Phase 1 was reconnaissance. For 3 days, I did nothing but watch and document. I sat in my truck, binoculars and camera at the ready, my field notebook open on the passenger seat. I logged every arrival and departure. The landscapers who came and tore out Eleanor's wildflower garden, replacing it with sterile, perfectly spaced boxwoods. The delivery truck that brought a massive, gaudy sectional sofa that I could see through the living room window. The boat dealer who delivered a brand new ski boat to my dock, a sleek monstrosity of fiberglass and chrome. Brenda entertained, extravagantly. I watched through my lens as she hosted parties on my deck. The deck Eleanor and I had sealed by hand every other spring. Strangers in designer clothes drank wine and laughed on the spot where my wife and I used to sit in comfortable silence, watching the loons. The sound of their shrill laughter carried across the water, a grating noise that felt like sandpaper on my soul. Her perfume, a cloying chemical-sweet scent, seemed to hang in the air even from a distance. The click, click, click of her acrylic nails on her phone was a sound I imagined, a sharp, irritating rhythm of entitlement. Everything about her was an invasion, a desecration. Each night I returned to the motel room and processed the data. I downloaded the photos, filed them in chronologically ordered folders. I transcribed my handwritten notes into a digital log, adding details and cross-references. I was building a case file, just as I would for a complex geological survey. This wasn't personal. Not anymore. It was a professional problem. A systems failure cascade that required a methodical, engineered solution. Phase 2 was research. I spent hours at the county clerk's office, a dusty place that smelled of old paper and decaying glue. I pulled the deeds for every property in the Lakeside Haven Estates. I requested the HOA's original articles of incorporation, the bylaws, the CC&Rs, and every amendment ever filed. I paid for copies of everything, creating a library of legal documents that I read line by line, highlighting and annotating. I was searching for a fracture point, a weakness in the structure of her power. Brenda escalated her attack, unaware that she was no longer the predator, but the prey being patiently observed. I received a certified letter at the P.O. box I'd set up. It was from the HOA on thick, expensive letterhead that felt like it had a trust fund. It was a formal notice of abandonment, levying thousands of dollars in fines against me for the degraded condition of the property and informing me of a special assessment to cover the cost of necessary improvements. The improvements, I knew from my surveillance, included her new boat and the catered parties. The letter was signed by Brenda McAllister, her signature a flamboyant, arrogant scrawl. I scanned the letter and added it to the file. It was another data point, another piece of evidence of her fatal overconfidence. She believed she was untouchable. She saw a quiet, grieving widower, a retired old man, and assumed I was a soft target. She had no idea she was trying to build her fraudulent castle on a geological fault line. I started digging into Brenda herself. Public records are a beautiful thing. I found her business filings. She ran a high-end interior design business out of her primary residence, the one she actually owned, a few miles away from the lake. The business, according to its state registration, was named McAllister Designs. A quick search of the HOA expenditures, which I had obtained through a public records request, showed multiple large payments to McAllister Designs for community beautification projects. She was using the HOA as her personal piggy bank, funneling money to herself for projects of dubious value. The new, ugly sign at the community entrance, the hideous floral arrangements in the clubhouse. It was a classic embezzlement scheme, small scale but brazen. The pieces were coming together. Her motive wasn't just a desire for a free lake house. It was greed, pure and simple. She was using my home as a showroom for her business, a place to entertain clients and project an image of success, all funded by her neighbors. My neighbors. But I still needed the key, the one piece of leverage that would shatter her foundation completely. I had a solid case for fraud and embezzlement, but the fight over the house itself could get tied up in court for years. I needed something faster, something more elegant, something that would provide a more satisfying resolution. I found it on the 4th day of research, in the deepest, dustiest part of the county archives. It wasn't in the digital records or the modern plat books. It was in a massive, leather-bound volume from 1956, the year the original dam was completed and the lake was formed. It was the original subdivision survey, drawn by hand in India ink on heavy linen paper. The lines were crisp, the cartographer's notes precise. My own property, Lot 17, was clearly delineated, and running right through the middle of Lot 15, Brenda McAllister's primary residence, was a dotted line I had never seen on any modern map. My heart began to beat a little faster. The notation was small, written in elegant cursive. 10-foot access and utility easement for dam maintenance. I followed the line. It ran from the main county road, straight across the front lawn of what was now Brenda's house, between her prize-winning rose bushes and her perfectly symmetrical Japanese maples, and ended at the shoreline. It was an old access path, created for the original dam builders to get their equipment to the water. I cross-referenced the volume's index. The easement had been properly recorded. I then spent the next 6 hours searching every subsequent record, every deed transfer, every zoning change. It was never extinguished. It was never abandoned. It was a legal, binding, and permanent feature of the land. The newer digital surveys, the ones the HOA and the local real estate agents used, had simply omitted it. A cartographical error. A ghost on the map. But my deed, the original one from when Eleanor and I bought the property 30 years ago, referenced the 1956 survey explicitly. Legally, that easement was as real as the ground beneath my feet, and it belonged to me, as the owner of Lot 17, for the purpose of accessing the lake. I leaned back in the hard wooden chair in the archive room, a slow smile spreading across my face. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen on a map. It was a legal nuclear bomb. Brenda had stolen my house, a property to which she had no right. And in a moment of exquisite irony, I had just discovered I owned a 10-foot wide path straight through the heart of hers. And according to the state statutes governing such easements, I had the right to improve and maintain it for its intended purpose. The rage in my chest was now a cool, calm engine of creation. It was time to move from reconnaissance to engineering. I drove back to my motel room, the precious copies of the 1956 survey map on the seat beside me like a sacred text. The design phase of my revenge began. I didn't want to just win. I wanted to deconstruct her. I wanted to use the tools of my own profession, precision, planning, and an intimate understanding of the foundational structure of things, to utterly dismantle hers. My first call was to a young lawyer named Ben Carter. His ad in the local paper read, "Tired of your HOA, so am I." He was young, hungry, and had a palpable disdain for petty tyrants like Brenda. I met him in his small, cluttered office. I didn't give him an emotional speech. I laid out the facts as if I were presenting a geological report. I placed the file on his desk, the surveillance logs, the photographs, the HOA letters, the evidence of embezzlement, and finally, like a trump card, the 1956 survey map. Ben's eyes lit up as he absorbed the information. He traced the easement on the old map with his finger, a grin spreading across his face. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, the glee in his voice barely contained. "This is exquisite." We spent the next 4 hours drafting the plan. It was a 3-pronged attack, designed for maximum legal and psychological impact. Prong 1 was the legal assault on her occupation of my house. Ben would file a quiet title action, an emergency injunction to have her immediately evicted, and a lawsuit for damages, including emotional distress and unlawful conversion of property. We would also prepare a comprehensive report on her forgery of the abandonment documents, which Ben would hand-deliver not to the local police, but to the State Attorney General's white-collar crime division. We would bypass the local network she undoubtedly controlled. Prong 2 was the embezzlement case. I contacted George and, through him, 2 other long-suffering neighbors who had been fined into submission by Brenda. Armed with the proof of her self-dealing that I had uncovered, they were eager to join a formal complaint. Ben drafted the paperwork for a class action lawsuit on behalf of the HOA members to recover the misappropriated funds. This complaint, too, would go directly to the state AG. But Prong 3 was my masterpiece. It was the physical manifestation of our legal rights. It was the psychological warfare. While the legal gears were turning, I would exercise my right to the easement running through her property. "So, you want to build a path?" Ben asked. "No," I replied, pulling a piece of drafting paper from my briefcase. I unrolled it on his desk. It was a detailed engineering schematic. "I want to build a fence." It wasn't just any fence. It was a 10-foot-high, industrial-grade, galvanized chain-link fence, the kind you see around power substations or prisons. The plan called for it to be set in 2-foot-deep concrete footings, spaced every 8 feet. It would run the full length of the easement, 150 feet from the road to the lake. It would perfectly bisect her property, cutting right through her prize-winning rose garden and her meticulously manicured lawn. And to add a final, beautiful touch, the plans specified dark green privacy slats to be woven through the chain link, completely blocking her view of the lake from her front windows. It would be aggressively, monumentally, and 100% legally ugly. "It's a security fence," I explained to Ben, a deadpan expression on my face, "to secure my access route from any potential encroachment." Ben stared at the schematic, then at me, and then he let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. "Arthur, you are a deeply terrifying man." The next week was a blur of methodical preparation. While Ben filed the initial court documents under seal, I put the physical plan into motion. I hired a commercial fencing company from 2 towns over, a crew that had no local allegiances. I showed them the survey, the deed, and a letter from Ben affirming my legal right. They were happy to take the job. I hired a separate surveying crew, not myself, to maintain objectivity, to officially mark the boundaries of the easement with wooden stakes and bright orange flagging tape. The day the surveyors arrived was the first time Brenda seemed to notice something was amiss. I watched from my vantage point across the lake. She came storming out of her house, the one she actually owned, and confronted the surveyors. I couldn't hear the words, but her body language was a symphony of rage. She pointed. She stabbed her finger at them. They calmly showed her their paperwork and continued their work. The line of orange flags running through her garden was a declaration of war. She had no idea how outgunned she was. She must have called her lawyer, a local good old boy who probably got her a slap on the wrist for a DUI once. The next day, Ben received a blustering cease and desist letter. Ben's response was simple. It was a copy of the 1956 plat map with the easement highlighted, a copy of my deed, and a single sentence. "We will proceed as planned." Brenda, meanwhile, made a fatal strategic error. Convinced this was all a bluff, she doubled down on her public campaign against me. She called a special emergency meeting of the Lakeside Haven Estates HOA. The agenda, printed on that same expensive letterhead and posted on the community bulletin board, was clear. Vote on the permanent seizure and disposal of the abandoned property at 17 Willow Lane. She was going to use the public forum to humiliate me and consolidate her power. She was walking directly into the kill zone. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smelled of pine cleaner and simmering resentment. It was packed. Nearly every homeowner was there, drawn by the promise of drama. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by two miserable-looking board members who looked like hostages. She was dressed in a severe navy blue suit, radiating an aura of absolute control. She saw me walk in with Ben and George, and a smug, predatory smile touched her lips. She began the meeting with a long, self-congratulatory speech about her commitment to community values and property preservation. She painted me as a delinquent owner, an outsider who had abandoned his responsibilities. She spoke of the blight my empty house had become and the decisive action she had been forced to take. It was a masterful performance of self-serving fiction. She purred, she admonished, she wrung every drop of fake concern from her words. When she was done, she looked directly at me. "The board now opens the floor for discussion before the vote," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness, although I can't imagine what there is to discuss. "I have a few items," I said, my voice calm and even in the quiet room. Ben set up a projector and a laptop on a small table. "A slideshow? How quaint," Brenda sneered. "I've always found that visual aids are helpful for clarifying complex data," I replied. I clicked the remote. The first slide lit up the screen behind her. It was a photo of Eleanor and me, 20 years younger, laughing as we laid the first course of stones for the fireplace. A murmur went through the crowd. "This is my wife, Eleanor," I said. "This is the house we built. It is not, nor has it ever been, abandoned." Click. The next slide was the 1956 plat map. I used a laser pointer to trace the boundaries of my property. Then I traced the boundaries of hers. And then I traced the bright red line of the easement that cut her land in two. "This," I said, "is a 10-foot wide access and utility easement, recorded in 1956. It grants the owner of Lot 17, that's me, unrestricted access to the lake through Lot 15. That's yours, Brenda." Brenda's smug expression faltered. A crack appeared in the Botoxed facade. That's not a real map. That's fake." "It's a certified copy from the county archives," Ben Carter said, his voice ringing with authority. "And it's referenced in Mr. Pendleton's deed. It's as real as it gets." Click. The next slide was a satellite image of Brenda's home, with a stark, red digital line running right through her rose garden. Superimposed over it was a photo of the industrial chain-link fence I had contracted to have built. The crowd gasped. "Construction begins tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp," I said conversationally. "I believe the noise ordinances allow for it. It's simply an improvement to secure my legal access route." Brenda was on her feet now, her face a mottled red. "This is harassment. It's illegal. You can't do this." "Oh, it's perfectly legal," Ben said cheerfully. "But let's talk about what's illegal." Click. The next slide showed blown-up images of the forged signatures on the abandonment notices she had filed, right next to my actual signature from my driver's license. The differences were laughably obvious. Click. The next slide was a spreadsheet, a detailed breakdown of the HOA's finances for the past year. I had highlighted several line items. Payment to McAllister Designs for landscaping consultation, $15,000. Payment to McAllister Designs for clubhouse decor update, $22,000. And my personal favorite, payment to McAllister Designs for emergency property remediation, at 17 Willow Lane, $35,000. That last one corresponded to the week her new sofa and ski boat were delivered. It appears, I said, letting the words hang in the air, that the HOA president has been using community funds to finance her own business and furnish my stolen house. The room erupted. The spell was broken. The hostage board members were staring at Brenda in horror. The other homeowners were shouting questions, pointing fingers. Brenda's composure, that carefully constructed shell of authority, didn't just crack. It shattered like cheap glass. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly thing. "It's all lies. He's a crazy old man. I was protecting our investments. I was doing my duty." She was unraveling, the carefully curated mask melting away to reveal the frantic, greedy creature beneath. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "I'll sue you. I'll ruin you. You'll never set foot in this community again." It was at that precise moment, as her meltdown reached its crescendo, that the double doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. 2 men and a woman in dark suits walked in, followed by 2 uniformed state troopers. They didn't hurry. They moved with the calm, inexorable purpose of a slow-moving lava flow. The lead agent held up a badge and a warrant. "Brenda McAllister?" he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. "You're under arrest for forgery, wire fraud, and embezzlement." The entire room fell silent. The only sound was the sharp, satisfying click of handcuffs being snapped onto Brenda's wrists. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. Her reign was over. The aftermath was swift and total. Brenda's case was open and shut. The evidence I had gathered was so thorough, so meticulously documented, that her lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She was sentenced to 5 years in a state penitentiary, with a restitution order that stripped her of every asset she had. Her primary residence, the one with the phantom fence line through its heart, was sold at auction to cover her debts. Her husband, a man who looked like he had been holding his breath for 20 years, filed for divorce the day after her sentencing and quietly disappeared. I got my house back, of course. The court invalidated every HOA action she had taken against me. Walking through the front door with my own key again was a feeling of profound peace. I spent the next month purging the house of her presence. The gaudy furniture was donated to a charity thrift store. The hideous curtains were burned in the fireplace. I hired a crew to rip out the sterile boxwoods, and, with George's help, we replanted Eleanor's wildflower garden. The fence? I never built it. The day after the meeting, I called the fencing company and canceled the order. The schematic, the threat, had served its purpose. It was never about the fence itself. It was about using the language of boundaries and property lines, the language Brenda thought she owned, to show her that some lines should never be crossed. The HOA was reformed. The terrified board members were replaced by a new group, led by George. With the funds recovered from Brenda's accounts through the restitution order and the class action settlement, they didn't just repair the community's finances, they created something new. They used a large portion of the money to build a beautiful little park on a piece of common land overlooking the lake. It has a small playground for the neighborhood kids and a quiet bench surrounded by wildflowers. They put up a small, simple bronze plaque. It reads, "The Eleanor Pendleton Memorial Park." I live in the lake house full-time now. The silence is no longer a weight. It's a comfort. I sit on the porch Eleanor and I designed, a cup of coffee in my hand, and I watch the sun rise over the water. Sometimes I think about Brenda McAllister. I picture her in a drab prison uniform, her world reduced to a concrete cell. I don't feel anger. I don't even feel pity. I feel a quiet, smug satisfaction, a sense of a system restored to balance. She saw an old, quiet man and underestimated me. She mistook patience for weakness and grief for surrender. She never understood that a surveyor spends his entire life looking for the truth buried beneath the surface. He knows that no matter how pretty the landscape, no matter how solid the ground appears, everything rests on the foundation, and hers was built on sand and lies. I just came back and showed everyone the map.